Okay, so TGP Day 1 has concluded today, and with TGP Day 1 having finished up, I wanted to take some time and kind of talk about what we saw today, talk about the narrative, talk about the storyline, talk about, like the setup of the TGP, and some of the tech and some of the strats that we've seen today. I'm going to, in general, probably be covering every single day of the TGP and just kind of summarizing what we saw and talking about like through the strats and kind of the most important pieces every single day. So if you like that kind of content, hope you enjoy. Basically, we are currently seeing Cup A with Mandatory, Perplexed, Mad, Shinra Tensei, Pedros Per Hour, and Exposed. For those who don't know, Exposed is probably the only team that hasn't necessarily competed in this type of format before. Whenever we went and we go and we look at qualifiers, Exposed is the 12 seed, Mandatory is the first seed. Exposed is the only team that's actually in this group that didn't post a 42 score. They actually posted a 39 score. So there were pretty massive underdogs coming into today. For those who don't know, the TGP does one elimination per day. And then, the top three teams at the end of day 3 are making it to globals for Cup A, B, and C. Cup A, B, and C are, this weekend, next weekend, and the weekend after that. Or I guess Cup C is now the finals, but, same thing. So it's 3 weekends in a row of TGP content. So Exposed, they got eliminated. They were actually pretty good. So we've actually kind of cut down the field, and we've seen the field get chopped down a little bit in terms of how many teams we are seeing. And so with there only being 12 teams, the level of play is actually a lot higher. And I felt like Exposed, if they had a little bit of a favorable break, or any of the rest of the teams here weren't able to put up this 58 points, Exposed would have been able to forego elimination. However, they were a little bit slower, so they lost on tiebreaker criteria. Now, the rest of the teams put up a 58, and I would say that all of the teams that put up a 58 kind of had a similar result today. Mandatory was close to a perfect day. They were as close to a perfect day as any of the teams in Cup A. However, they had a pretty big issue in the middle of their day. So basically, you have to have you have to have 20 minutes of break timer, and so you can see Mandatory in the top left here. You have to have 20 minutes worth of break timer that's used out throughout the day, and you have to use it within a specific window. Mandatory was and they were about to actually fall outside that window, and so they had to wipe 26 minutes into this Noku 19, which is really bad. Like, they lost 26 minutes in this Noku defensive because either they weren't aware or they didn't really understand the ramifications of not taking your break timer. For those who don't know, the penalty for not taking your break is actually 5 key points, which clearly it would have eliminated them, so they had to zone out. And so beyond that, all of the teams had a couple of mistakes here and there. I think that with the keystone scaling and the key levels being as difficult as they are, it makes sense that teams are going to make mistakes, especially as the keys continue to progress. All right, let's talk about strats. So first and foremost, I actually want to talk about the team that got eliminated here, Exposed. So this first area of Noku defensive is kind of interesting, where you see a lot of teams either 2 or 3 pulling this first area. And I think the teams that were 2 pulling this first area, by and large, got a favorable exchange here. You see Exposed here doing a very large first pull, which then allowed them to have their second pull be a lot easier. I wonder if teams are going to kind of adapt to this, where Exposed sent their tank really far away and had them grab all the longbowmen, grab all the planestriders and the lancers, and they're actually doing a triple mound pull in this first pull. And so then once they get on top of this pole, basically they're camped out here. The longbows, whenever your tank pulls the longbows like a very far distance, they like to do this thing where they'll lock onto the tank and they won't actually be looking to shoot anybody else. Now, the downside of doing it like this is because it's going to be very difficult for your healer and your Augavoker to come out of the spot and knock the mobs away. So eventually, your players are going to have to come out of the spot to manage Sanguine, but starting up on the spot, I think, for Exposed was really, really solid. Next clip up we have here, we have the Mandatory first pull of Azure Vault. Actually, that's not what we have here at all. Oh, yes, we do. Okay. In the bottom right, we have the Mandatory first pull of Azure Vault. I accidentally rewinded it a bit too much. And so Mandatory was actually running a very different route than everybody else in AV, where they were doing just a few of these lashers, and they weren't actually doing a very large first trash pull, and they were lusting these trees. And that allowed them to actually get Laymore pulled rather quickly, where a lot of other groups actually went for a much larger first pull with their Bloodlust. But Mandatory, it seemed like they were making up a bunch of time just with this first area. And then after they were doing that, then they would come back at the very end of the dungeon. I can actually scrub forward and look for the mandatory end of this dungeon. And they would port back to the very beginning and then do a large trash pull like you see on screen right here, where they would just port back up and then get the final 13% remaining count. On top of that, we have three other clips, actually. So pages per hour in the top left here. Most teams were actually going into that frog cafeteria right cave area after the first boss, but pages per hour in the top left actually went for a very, very aggressive pull, pulling all the shock casters or shock troopers and all the mini bosses and whatnot with their second lust of the dungeon. Now, I think that this strat, it looked like it would ended up being a little bit slower than some of the other teams in the 20, but I think that this is a strat that will actually scale really well into the 21 and it be a lot more consistent than some of the other teams, because the other teams look like they were having a hard time dealing with those frogs. Now, it does require perfect player movement and stuff like that to deal with that frog gauntlet. And so I kind of think that pages per hour in the top left-hand corner of the screen, running this different route, I think was actually kind of unique. On top of that, we saw another first area strat for Shinara Tensei in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen. I'm trying to back it up to the point where you guys can actually see what's going on. So Shinara Tensei right here, they're actually on this pole. And you saw this earlier from Exposed, and you're like, oh, okay, what's different here? So they're actually on a different pole. As you can see, here's the triple lances relative to what the pole that they're standing on is. And what this allows them to do is this allows them to grab this pack right here, and this pack right here, the patrol, this pack right here, and this pack right here, and then pull it all into this lance. And Shinara Tensei had a difficult time of actually setting this up correctly to begin with. But I think that as the day went on, they got more and more consistent getting this pole set up, getting people on top of this pole, making sure that the war spears weren't going to be charging them. And they actually started to create a very interesting strat where they were getting a lot more count in the first area than other teams. Other teams were probably leaving the first area with about 20 some odd percent, where Shinara Tensei was leaving with 35% or something like that. And I think that that's a strat that I wouldn't be shocked if more teams adopt it, because basically the first pull ends up being just all of this garbage that I was outlining right here. And then your second pull is that traditional lust pull from a lot of groups, but you're getting a lot better value out of lust. And then you're not three pulling it, where we saw some of the other teams like Perplexed and Madge actually three pulling this first area, which is easier to deal with for Sanguine, but it's not perfect, if that makes sense. The last strat that we have right here, and it's the strat on the thumbnail actually, is the pages per hour. You can actually see them in the bottom right. They're going to be pulling this pack that's off to the corner. So basically, to finish off the 93 to 100% count, you either do one of two things. You do the Balakar Khan trash that's in front of the mini boss, which is what most people do, or alternatively, you can pull this patrol and you can melt off the Balakar Khan trash. What pages per hour figured out is that these pack that has a war spear, a defender, and has two thunder fists in it, is that you can actually get on top of these wooden pillars here and avoid getting charged by the war spear. And it's using a similar strat to actually what we saw in the first area, where you're z-axising the war spear charge to where they're permanently targeted on the furthest player, so they'll never actually pick you. And so now what you see is they're actually sitting up on top of these poles here, making sure that those war spears will never cast. Then all you have to do is kind of CC the thunder fists, and this is actually a much safer pull. On top of that, you get better Shadow Priest funnel and you get more efficient damage gained out of that. And I thought that this strat was actually fairly interesting. I kind of like this a lot more than doing the two mini bosses into the boss. We've actually saw a lot of teams looking to just play these double mini bosses into the boss, but I think that after looking at this spot that pages per hour we're in, that might be something that other teams are looking to adopt and pull into their bag of tricks. Let's talk about the affixes. So first off, we have Hall's Infusion with Tyrannical Entangling Bursting. We have Azure Vault with Tyrannical Afflicted Bolstering, and we have Noku Defensive with Fortified Incorporeal Sanguine. Noku Defensive is probably the most technically challenging dungeon out of the set, where Sanguine is really, really annoying. But fortunately enough, Sanguine's only annoying at the very beginning of the dungeon, which means that you can reset the dungeon a lot, and you saw teams resetting the beginning of the dungeon a lot. Avoiding Sanguine healing, particularly in that first area, is a common goal for all of these teams, and there were some ways that people were trying to deal with all of the Sanguine. For Azure Vault, it's Tyrannical Afflicted Bolstering. Bolstering is probably the problem affix here, bolstering a Tyrannical. I pulled up some stats from live keys off Azure Vault Tyrannical. There hasn't yet been a 22 that's timed, but I think that all of these teams are going to be able to put up a 22 in Azure Vault tomorrow. I don't necessarily expect a 23 to be doable just because it is Tyrannical, but I do expect a 22 is going to be fine. Bolstering, Some of the breaker pulls with bolstering can be a bit problematic, but with the composition that everybody's running with the Fire Mage, Shadow Priest, Evoker, it's mostly fine. Then, for Halls of Infusion, Tyrannical Entangling Bursting. This dungeon's pretty straight up. I think that every team is going to be able to do this dungeon on a 21 key level. The biggest drawback of this dungeon is going to be doing it on a 21 and maintaining your healer's mana on Kajin, which is the third boss. We saw a lot of healers actually starting to run really dry on that 20. So I think that 21, the healer output's there. It's more about, making sure that they can maintain that mana. Okay, so storylines aside and potential key levels aside. Oh, okay, in Noku Defensive, I think the Noku Defensive is probably going to be doable on a 21. I don't think that teams are going to be looking to do that dungeon on a 22. While it does seem like it's maybe possible, I don't think it's going to be likely on Sanguine. I think that Sanguine's going to be a huge pain point for being able to get that dungeon done on a 22. So I think that if you can get a fast 21, you just get out of there for the weekend. So I think that the dungeons that we saw from today, they're probably going to finish on Sunday at a 21, a 22, and then a 21. Overall, though, that's basically what we saw from Group A, where Mandatory is slightly in the lead. I'm kind of excited to see what's going to happen tomorrow. I have no idea who's necessarily going to be eliminated. It looks like pages per hour is slightly worse time tiebreaker-wise, but I think with how close all of these teams are, it's really going to be up in the air. I think that, again, all of these teams posted that 42 points in time trial, so I think that the skill level of these teams is about equitable, so I don't think that any team is like a significant favorite or a significant underdog to be rooting for this. I do think that Mandatory is very likely to make it to the final day and to be able to make it to the global finals, but I think that there's a world where they could still get eliminated, and I think that that's the beauty of the TGP. All in all, I'm excited to see what 2 dungeons we get tomorrow. I hope you guys enjoyed the TGP coverage, and I will see you guys later. Goodbye.